In 1887, working out of a rented room on the Rue Lepic in Paris, Vincent van Gogh painted a small stretch of ordinary ground. There is no church tower in it, no peasant bent over a scythe, no figure of any kind. Just grass, thick and short, scattered with the white heads of dandelions gone to seed, rendered in quick strokes of green and yellow that seem to vibrate against each other rather than sit still on the canvas. The brushwork is loose, almost hurried in places, built from short dashes that owe an obvious debt to the pointillist experiments happening around him that year. Van Gogh called it une pelouse, a patch of grass, and by any ordinary account it is one of the smaller, quieter works from his 2 years in the city, the kind of painting a museum visitor might walk past on the way to the sunflowers. But something about the surface of this canvas never sat entirely right with the conservators who examined it closely, decade after decade. Under raking light, the paint film shows an unevenness that doesn't correspond to anything visible in the finished grass, ridges and troughs running beneath the green, like the memory of a different composition pressing up from below. For more than a century, nobody knew why. If this kind of close looking is what you come here for, hit the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me which painting you want me to look at next. The request list is where a lot of these scripts begin. The painting had been catalogued, studied for its color and its brushwork, exhibited under a description that mentioned nothing beyond what its surface showed. What was underneath it, and why it was there, stayed a secret the 20th century simply did not have the instruments to ask about. That question only makes sense once you understand what Van Gogh's life looked like in the 2 years before this particular canvas existed. He arrived in Paris in March of 1886, moving into his brother Theo's small apartment on the Rue Laval, and later into the larger flat on the Rue Lepic, and the change amounts to something close to a second career. The paintings he had made in the Netherlands before this, the dark, earth-toned studies of peasants eating potatoes and weavers hunched over their looms, belonged to a palette built out of Dutch masters and second-hand reproductions of Millet, brown and black, and the deep, muddy green of a country he rarely painted in full daylight. Paris undid nearly all of it within months. He met Camille Pissarro, Paul Signac, and eventually Georges Seurat, watched the divisionists build color out of small, unmixed strokes set beside each other, rather than blended on a palette, and began tearing his own technique apart in public view, canvas after canvas, trying to catch up to a movement that was itself only a few years old. Theo, who worked as an art dealer for the firm Goupil and Company, supported him financially through nearly all of it, an arrangement that meant food, rent, paint, and canvas all came out of the same increasingly strained monthly allowance. Vincent was 33 years old, unable to sell his work in any meaningful volume, and producing at a pace that would have strained an artist with unlimited resources, let alone one entirely reliant on his brother's patience, and a Paris art market that had not yet decided what to make of him. His letters from these years return again and again to money, to what he owed Theo, to what a tube of paint cost against what a week of food cost. Arithmetic that shows up far more often in the correspondence than any discussion of gallery interest or critical reception, because there was so little of either to discuss. The math of that arrangement matters more than it might first appear to, because it explains a detail about Van Gogh's studio practice that historians only fully appreciated once conservation science gave them a specific reason to look. During his 2 years in Paris, he completed more than 200 paintings, an extraordinary output that included dozens of self-portraits, since he could not always afford to pay a model, and his own face, at least, cost nothing beyond the paint required to render it. Canvas itself cost money that Theo's allowance did not always stretch far enough to cover, particularly during stretches when Vincent was working at his fastest and burning through material faster than the household budget could reasonably absorb. So Van Gogh did what a great number of financially strapped painters throughout history have done when faced with the same arithmetic. He reused surfaces. When a study didn't satisfy him, when a composition failed or simply stopped being useful, he would sometimes scrape the paint down with a palette knife, or paint directly over it without scraping at all, turning a discarded picture into a fresh enough ground for whatever idea came next. Art historians had already documented several instances of this habit, both in his surviving letters, where he occasionally mentions painting over an old study, and in technical examinations of other canvases from the period that showed clear evidence of an earlier composition underneath. So by the time conservators turned serious, sustained attention to Une Pelouse, the theory that something older might be sitting beneath the grass was not a speculative leap. It was, if anything, the expected explanation for a paint surface behaving this strangely. What nobody could do, for the better part of a century, was see what that older painting actually was. And that gap between suspicion and confirmation is where the story sits for most of the 20th century. An open question the equipment of the era simply could not close. Standard X-radiography, the technique museums had relied on since the early 1900s to look through paint layers, works by measuring how different pigments absorb X-rays depending on the density of the metals or minerals they contain. Lead white, heavily used as a ground and a base layer by nearly every 19th century painter working in oils, shows up brightly under X-ray across almost the entire canvas, which is useful for catching a change in composition, but nearly useless for reading fine detail, because that same dense lead ground tends to swamp whatever thinner, less dense paint sits above or beneath it. An X-ray of Une Pelouse taken decades earlier had picked up exactly this kind of interference. Vague masses, an impression that something else occupied the space under the grass, nothing that resolved into a recognizable image of any kind. The people looking at those early X-ray plates could tell a second composition existed. They could not tell what it showed, whether it was a figure, a still life, or simply an earlier, abandoned version of the same field. That gap between knowing something was hidden and knowing what it was sat unresolved through most of the century, a limitation of the equipment rather than a failure of curiosity or attention. The tool that finally closed that gap did not come out of an art conservation laboratory at all. It came out of materials science and particle physics, disciplines that had spent decades building instruments for entirely different purposes, and only later found a second life inside museum conservation departments. In 2008, a research team led by Joris Dick, a professor at Delft University of Technology with a background in paint chemistry and heritage science, working alongside Koen Janssens, a chemist at the University of Antwerp specializing in the elemental analysis of historical pigments, brought Une Pelouse to a synchrotron facility, a particle accelerator capable of producing X-ray beams many orders of magnitude more intense and more precisely tunable than anything available in a museum basement. Rather than capturing a single flat image the way conventional radiography does, the team used a technique called scanning macro X-ray fluorescence, which moves a narrow, high-intensity beam across a painting's surface point by point, measuring not simply whether X-rays pass through the paint, but which specific chemical elements fluoresce back out when the beam strikes them. Antimony behaves differently from mercury under that kind of bombardment. Mercury behaves differently from lead, and lead behaves differently again from cobalt, zinc, or chromium. Each element used in 19th century pigments carries its own fluorescent signature, distinct enough to be separated out even when the elements sit stacked on top of one another in layers a fraction of a millimeter thick. By scanning the entire canvas and recording those signatures point by point, building up what amounts to a series of chemical maps rather than a single visual image, the researchers could reconstruct a picture of paint layers that had been physically buried under the surface of Une Pelouse for more than 100 years, without removing a single flake of the grass that Van Gogh had painted over it. The scan took place at a synchrotron radiation laboratory in Hamburg, one of the few facilities in Europe with a beamline stable and powerful enough to sit trained on a single square meter of canvas for the length of time a full elemental map required. Setting a 19th century oil painting in front of a particle accelerator built for physics research is not, on its face, an obvious pairing, and getting Une Pelouse there at all took cooperation between the Kröller-Müller Museum, the two universities, and the laboratory itself, an arrangement built on the argument that the painting would come back from Hamburg no less stable than it arrived, since the scan is entirely non-invasive and leaves no physical trace on the surface beyond the hours spent under the beam. For conservators accustomed to treating any technical examination of a masterwork as a small risk to be weighed carefully, that non-invasive quality was the reason the request was approved at all. Nothing about the canvas needed to be touched, scraped, or sampled to answer a question people had been asking about it since at least the 1930s, when the museum's own early X-ray plates first suggested that something odd sat beneath the grass, without ever managing to say what it was. Those earlier attempts matter for understanding just how much of a leap the 2008 scan represented. Conventional radiography had been part of museum practice since shortly after Wilhelm Röntgen's original discovery of X-rays in the 1890s, and by the interwar period a number of major collections, the Kröller-Müller among them, had begun routinely X-raying paintings suspected of concealing earlier compositions or later restorations. The technology improved steadily across the following decades, but the underlying physical limitation Dick and Janssens were working around, the way a dense lead ground swamps the finer variation in whatever sits above or below it, never went away. Every X-ray taken of Une Pelouse between the 1930s and the early 2000s had returned some version of the same frustrating result. Unmistakable evidence of a second, buried composition, and no way to resolve that evidence into a recognizable image. 70 years of conservators had known a secret existed without ever being able to read it. What emerged, slowly, scan line by scan line over the course of the imaging session, was not an abstract shape or a formless smear of pigment. It was a face. A woman's head, turned in three-quarter profile, wearing a dark bonnet or headscarf of exactly the kind Van Gogh had painted repeatedly during his earlier years in Nuenen, in the southern Netherlands, when his primary subject was the rural laboring poor, peasant women bent over looms or seated at plain wooden tables, studies he made in direct preparation for what eventually became the potato eaters. The mercury map, tracing what was very likely vermilion used for warmth in the skin tones, showed the modeling of a cheek and a jawline. The antimony and lead maps together resolved the darker mass of the headscarf against a lighter, undefined background behind her. None of it matched any surviving finished painting in the accepted Van Gogh catalogue, and that mismatch was, in its own way, the finding that mattered most out of everything the scan turned up. Art historians had long known, from his correspondence with Theo, that Van Gogh made and then lost or destroyed a good many of the peasant studies he produced in Nuenen, works described in letters but never accounted for in later inventories of his estate after his death. This buried portrait was, in effect, one of those missing works surfacing again, not destroyed after all in the sense the historical record had assumed, simply buried, its pigments still physically present, under a Parisian lawn painted 2 years and 1 country later. Van Gogh himself had written to Theo during the Nuenen period about the difficulty of the peasant head studies, describing his frustration at how many attempts it took before a face stopped looking posed and started looking, in his own words, like a person who actually worked the fields for a living. Roughly 50 individual head studies survive from that project in some form, held across museums and private collections, most of them small, unsigned, and treated by scholars as working material rather than finished paintings in their own right. The woman under Une Pelouse would have been, at most, one more entry in that same working set, distinguishable from the others mainly by the fact that no one had ever seen her before the scan resolved her out of a chemical map rather than out of paint anyone could look at directly. What made the identification feel secure to the researchers, rather than speculative, was the consistency across several independent pieces of evidence. The bonnet style matched garments Van Gogh painted repeatedly during exactly this period and nowhere else in his output. The proportions of the head and the angle of the turn matched his habitual way of positioning a sitter slightly off-center rather than square to the viewer, a compositional habit visible across dozens of his surviving portraits from these years. And the physical stratigraphy, the fact that this composition sat directly beneath the Paris grass with no gap in time or handling between them, ruled out the alternative explanation that the hidden image might belong to an entirely different artist who had once owned or reused the same canvas before it reached Van Gogh. Taken together, those 3 lines of evidence gave the attribution a degree of confidence that art historians rarely get to claim about an unsigned, previously unknown work. The elemental maps could not recover color exactly as the human eye would have seen it originally, since fluorescence intensity reflects the concentration of an element rather than a precise calibrated hue, and the zones where the overlying grass happened to use chemically similar pigments to the hidden portrait-created areas, the scan genuinely could not separate with full confidence. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Dick and Janssens were careful, in the paper they eventually published in the journal Analytical Chemistry, to describe the reconstructed image as a representation built from elemental distribution, rather than a faithful color photograph of the lost painting underneath. But even with those limits stated plainly in the methodology, what the scan produced was unambiguous enough to be recognized almost immediately by anyone familiar with Van Gogh's Nuenen period portraiture. The composition, the pose, the type of headscarf, all of it sat comfortably alongside works like Head of a Peasant Woman, a series he painted with something close to obsession in those same years while working toward the potato eaters, returning to the same handful of local models over and over until he felt he had understood how to paint a face honestly rather than merely accurately. This buried woman was, most likely, one more attempt within that same series, made and then, for reasons no surviving letter explains directly, judged not worth keeping. Why Van Gogh painted over her rather than simply setting the canvas aside is a question the elemental maps cannot answer, and the honest account of this discovery has to sit with that gap, rather than paper over it with invented certainty about his state of mind. What the technical record does establish, cleanly and without ambiguity, is the sequence of events. The peasant portrait came first, datable to his Nuenen years based on style, palette, and subject matter. The Paris grass came second, applied directly on top without any intervening ground layer, meaning Van Gogh did not gesso over the old paint before starting the new composition. He simply began painting grass across an existing, apparently finished or nearly finished, face. Conservators reading that stratigraphy point to the practical explanation before reaching for the poetic one. Canvas, even inexpensive Parisian canvas, bought by the roll, cost money he frequently did not have on hand, and a painting he no longer valued represented, quite literally, free material sitting in his studio. The theory that a working painter under real financial pressure would recycle a surface he judged no longer useful requires no dramatic reading of his psychology. It requires only an accurate accounting of what materials cost and what a struggling, prolific artist in 1887 could and could not afford to waste. What changes once the elemental map is placed beside the finished grass is not the grass itself. The brushwork on the visible surface remains exactly what it was before anyone at Delft or Antwerp turned a synchrotron beam on the canvas, loose green strokes echoing the divisionist experiments of his new Parisian circle, a small, unassuming study that most catalogues have historically described in a single line. What changes is the account of what Une Pelouse actually is as a physical object. It is no longer simply a landscape study from Van Gogh's Paris period. It is a landscape study painted directly on top of a lost portrait from his Nuenen period, two entirely different moments in his development, physically stacked within the thickness of a single paint film, separated by roughly 2 years, and by a move from the rural Netherlands to the center of the European avant-garde. The painting the public has looked at for more than a century turns out to have never fully let go of the painting underneath it. Every brushstroke of grass sits directly on top of a face that Van Gogh, for reasons of economy or dissatisfaction, or some combination of both, decided the world did not need to see. This also forces a correction to something art historians had treated for decades as reasonably settled, the scope of Van Gogh's surviving Nuenen output. Catalogues of his work, compiled first by his sister-in-law Jo van Gogh Bonger in the years after his death and refined across the 20th century by successive generations of scholars, are built almost entirely from paintings that physically exist and can be examined directly, supplemented by descriptions in his letters of works that were lost, sold, or destroyed, and never recovered by any museum or private collection. A painting known only through elemental fluorescence mapping, invisible to the naked eye and inaccessible to physical study in any conventional sense, does not fit cleanly into either of those established categories. It exists, in the sense that its pigment is still physically present, embedded in the paint layer, detectable and mappable with the right equipment. It does not exist, in the sense that no living person has ever seen it as a complete, viewable image, only as a reconstruction assembled from where certain metals happen to fluoresce under an artificially intense beam of X-rays. The Delft and Antwerp team handed scholars a category they had not previously needed, a painting that is simultaneously present and unrecoverable, real in its material trace, and permanently out of reach as a direct visual experience. That category matters well beyond this one canvas, because Une Pelouse was not treated as an isolated curiosity once the results were published. It became, within the conservation science community, one of the founding demonstrations that scanning macro X-ray fluorescence could recover buried compositions that conventional X-radiography had only ever hinted at, without ever resolving into a legible image. Museums holding other paintings suspected of hiding earlier work beneath their surface. Canvases by artists known to have worked under exactly the kind of financial precarity that made reuse a common practice, suddenly had a technique capable of testing those suspicions properly, rather than leaving them as speculative footnotes in a condition report. The specific find under one small, minor Van Gogh landscape ended up mattering less, in the long run, than the demonstrated proof that this kind of recovery was possible at all on a canvas with several distinct paint layers built up over time. Conservation laboratories across Europe and North America adopted variations of the same scanning approach in the years that followed, applying it to works by other painters known to have reworked their own surfaces under pressures of cost, changing patronage, or simple, ordinary dissatisfaction with an earlier attempt. The financial explanation, in Van Gogh's specific case, also lines up with something else his letters make clear about these 2 years in Paris, which is that he did not think of any single painting as sacred while he was still working out how to make it. He treated canvases the way a person taking notes treats a page, filling it, judging the result, and in a fair number of cases deciding the page had served its purpose and could be written over. Later in his life, after he left Paris for Arles and then for Saint-Rémy, his letters show a different relationship to his own output, a growing awareness that individual paintings were being sold, exhibited, and discussed by name, which appears to have made him more reluctant to destroy or paint over finished work. The Nuenen peasant head buried under Une Pelouse belongs to an earlier version of that relationship, a period when he was still, in his own estimation, a student rather than a finished artist, producing studies meant to teach him something about the human face rather than objects intended to last. Reading the reuse this way does not require treating the buried woman as a discarded failure in any simple sense. It requires only recognizing that Van Gogh, at this specific point in 1887, judged the lesson of that portrait complete, and the canvas itself more valuable empty than full, a judgment made quickly, in a working studio, by a painter with rent to think about, and no reason yet to assume anyone would ever come looking for what he had painted over. There is also a narrower, more technical implication worth sitting with, one that has less to do with Van Gogh personally, and more to do with how confident anyone can be about the boundaries of his surviving catalogue going forward. If one small Paris landscape, chosen for scanning largely because its surface texture looked slightly wrong under raking light, turned out to be hiding an entire unrecorded portrait, the obvious question is how many other paintings in public and private collections carry the same kind of buried layer without anyone having yet pointed a synchrotron beam at them. Conservation scientists who have written about the Une Pelouse case since its publication have generally been careful not to overstate this, since scanning every painting in a major collection at a facility with limited beam time available is neither practical nor, in most cases, necessary. But the case did shift the baseline assumption in the field, from treating reuse as an occasional curiosity worth investigating painting by painting, to treating it as a real, quantifiable possibility for any artist known to have worked under financial constraint, reuse habits, or a documented practice of scraping down failed studies. None of the questions this raises are answerable with the same confidence the elemental map itself commands, and that difference is worth being precise about. The map tells you what pigments sit where, down to a fraction of a millimeter, with a degree of chemical certainty that most 19th century attribution disputes never get close to. It does not tell you what Van Gogh was thinking on the day he picked up that particular canvas, rather than a blank one. And any account that claims otherwise is filling a gap the science left open with narrative rather than evidence. The strongest version of this story is the one that keeps those two registers separate, stating plainly what the scan established, and marking clearly where interpretation begins. That discipline matters more here than it might in a case with less at stake, because the temptation to read a hidden face as a confession, a secret, or a symbol runs strong in exactly the kind of story this is, and Van Gogh's own biography, with its later history of illness and self-injury, makes that temptation especially easy to reach for. The honest reading resists it. A working painter, short on money, painted over an old study because the study was finished serving its purpose, and the canvas was not. None of this has changed how Une Pelouse is displayed today. It hangs at the Kröller-Müller Museum in Otterlo, in the Netherlands, alongside one of the largest public collections of Van Gogh's work anywhere in the world, shown exactly as it has always been shown, a modest study of grass and dandelions from his first months, absorbing the lessons of Parisian color theory. There is no plaque in the gallery describing the face underneath it, no attempt to display the elemental map beside the finished canvas for visitors to compare directly. The buried portrait exists almost entirely within the scientific literature and in the archives of the institutions that scanned it, a documented fact rather than a public spectacle mounted for the museum floor. That gap between what the object physically contains and what the gallery wall communicates to the person standing in front of it is in its own way the most honest summary of what this whole case revealed. The painting never stopped containing both compositions at once. It was only ever the equipment of the 20th century that kept one of them a secret, and once the right instrument finally existed, that secret stopped being a mystery altogether and became, instead, simply a second and equally true fact about a picture people had been looking at, without ever fully seeing, for more than 100 years. The wider lesson conservation scientists have drawn from the case is a modest one, and it is worth stating in its modest form rather than inflating it. Scanning macro X-ray fluorescence did not rewrite Van Gogh's biography, did not change his sale prices, and did not alter a single line of the standard account of his 2 years in Paris. What it did was close a specific, century-old gap between suspicion and knowledge for one painting, and in doing so gave the field a working method for closing the same gap elsewhere, painting by painting, whenever a curator has a reason to ask the question and a facility willing to schedule the beam time. Most paintings suspected of hiding an earlier composition will likely never be scanned this way, simply because the resources required, the synchrotron access, the specialist teams, the imaging time remain scarce relative to the number of paintings in the world with a plausible reuse history. Pelouse was scanned because a particular set of researchers, a particular museum, and a particular piece of anomalous surface texture aligned at a moment when the technology had just become capable of answering the question properly. Most paintings are still waiting for that alignment, if it ever comes at all. That scarcity is part of why this case gets returned to so often in conservation literature, well beyond what the modest size of the painting itself would seem to justify. It is treated less as a story about one lost portrait and more as proof of concept, a demonstration held up whenever a museum is deciding whether an expensive, resource-intensive scan of some other suspect canvas is worth pursuing. The peasant woman under the Paris grass became, in that sense, an argument on behalf of every other hidden painting still waiting somewhere in the world's collections, evidence that the gap between a suspicious paint surface and a confirmed second composition can in fact be closed, given the right instrument and enough patience to use it properly. Stand in front of une pelouse now, or look closely at a reproduction of it, and the grass is still just grass, quick strokes of green and yellow scattered with white dandelion heads, exactly as Van Gogh left it in 1887. Nothing about the visible surface asks you to imagine a face underneath it, and nothing about the wall text will tell you one is there. That absence is precisely what makes the elemental map worth holding in mind while you look. Somewhere in the thickness of that paint, beneath color you can see and color you cannot, a Nuenen peasant woman Van Gogh judged not worth keeping is still there, rendered now in mercury and antimony, rather than pigment the eye can register directly, present in every technical sense and visible in almost none, waiting for whichever instrument comes after the synchrotron to read her more completely than 2008 ever managed to. She has been part of this painting the entire time. It just took the world 121 years to find a way to ask her to show herself. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.